After World War II, Africa was still made up of European colonies. The Africans who had native origins were forced to take the less skilled jobs in the workforce. Most of the colonies in Africa focused on export crops to make money. The money that was made off the crops was sent to the Europeans or the foreign merchants. The farmers in Africa used the fertile land to grow food and crops for themselves, but the land was eventually turned into desert as a result of the cultivation of cash crops. Political parties began forming in order for the natives to gain independence from the foreign influence. Both the Convention People's Party and Kenya African National Union were nonviolent political parties formed in an attempt to gain independence. Kenya and Egypt first gained their independence through terrorism, which was used in Kenya, and a coup d'etat in Egypt. South Africans became violent after the government stiffened their segregation laws, leading to their independence. Algeria had a rebellion against the colonials, and the newly elected president of France made them independent. Tunisia and Morocco gained independence after a little unrest in society. Since colonialism came to Africa later than Asia, African countries reacted and became independent later than Asian countries did.
After the rapid decolonization of Africa following World War II, the era of independence in Africa began. Two major political and economical ideals were present: Western capitalism and Soviet socialism. Countries that gained their independence peacefully, such as Kenya, tended to lean towards capitalism. The more violent separations often resulted in a form of socialism. Tanzania, Ghana, and Guinea are examples of this fact. On the right is a map of the modern independent countries in Africa that were a result of the era of independence following World War II. Pan-Africanism was led by the African middle class who were educated in Western language and government and shared democratic values. It is the idea of a continental unity throughout Africa. The African personality also began to arise at this time. It centered around the belief in negritude or blackness. This idea was a radical response to the Western superiority brought on by colonization. Therefore, negritude had more of an appeal to the colonies that suffered harsher rule, such as French colonial possessions. These beliefs led to the formation of the Organization of African Unity by Addis Ababa in 1963, the flag of which is shown below. Although African countries were legally independent, they relied heavily on Western powers, bringing on the idea of neocolonialism. By running a major business in a country or supplying the military, Western powers continued to control much of the so-called independent Africa. Neocolonialism had many problems just as the old system did. Many African countries were dependent on the export of a single product, such as palm nuts and oils. When the prices of these products fluctuated worldwide, the African economy suffered heavily. Tariffs placed during the war and incentives for domestic producing rather than trade prevented Africa from advancing in the global market. Africa was behind technology-wise because of the failure of Western powers to educate and develop these countries. So Western technology had to be imported, which became increasingly more expensive with the demand and the war. The little money that was raised through the trading industry was used for the military to battle out civilian wars that arose from artificial borders. Because of this, no money was being placed into the building infrastructure or other civilian matters. To top it all off, corruption and bribery were common among all places of the government. Many of the proxy wars during the Cold War were fought in Africa. During 1960, the U.S. and its allied Western powers attempted to prevent Patrice Lumumba from gaining a place in the Zaire government. Lumumba was educated by the Soviets, and the U.S. feared that he would implement Soviet ideas into the government of Zaire, later known as the People's Republic of the Congo. These wars between the U.S. and the USSR further convinced the African population that they should work to eliminate Western influence from Africa. Many countries, however, remained neutral during the Cold War, forming their own pact. Because of the artificial borders left by colonizers, there were many ethnic groups that often disagreed under a single government. This led to a series of civil wars and conflicts throughout Africa. Regionalism and tribalism also prevented nationalism from making an impact. In southern Nigeria, the Igbo tribes attempted to separate from Nigeria and form their own country of Biafra. This attempt failed. The spread of Islam and its conflict with other religious beliefs was yet another conflict within the country's borders. During the 1980s, the African population increased by 3%, the highest on any continent. At the same time, drought conditions and the desertification, or the spreading of the Sahara caused by overcultivation of the land, led to hunger and starvation across Africa. In addition, the AIDS epidemic hit Africa hard. An estimated 1/3 of the population was infected. The high rate of spread of this disease had a lot to do with the African culture. A lack of sexual protection and traditions, such as a widow having sexual relations with a male relative of her deceased husband's family, helped spread the virus like wildfire. The poverty epidemic accompanies this all. 3/4 of the people live off the land, most of which are in poverty-like situations. Refugees from rural areas congregate in cities. This overpopulation in the cities, combined with insufficient transportation, sanitation, electricity, water, and traffic flow, resulted in unacceptable conditions. Albert Ajuka, a Kenyan poet, wrote "Pedestrian to Passing Benzman," describing the conditions. A Benzman is a slang term for a rich African that owns and drives a Mercedes-Benz. You man, lifted gently out of poverty and suffering, we so recently shared. I say, why splash the muddy puddle on my bare legs, as if, still unsatisfied with your seated opulence, you must sully the unwashed with your diesel smoke and mud water, and force him to buy, behind his means, a bar of soap from your shop. A few years back we shared a master, today you have none, while I have exchanged a parasite for something worse. But maybe a few years is too long a time.
In Tanzania, economic inequality was rife throughout the country. As a result, African leaders had to make very rash decisions. They restricted foreign investment, nationalized major industries and utilities, and promoted democratic ideals and values. Julius Nyerere promoted ideas of socialism and self-reliance. This led to the creation of the Arusha Declaration in 1967. Nyerere set principles for a socialist society and said that they would accept neither a dictator of the proletariat, referring to Lenin, or a multi-party democracy government. Nyerere placed further limitations on income and established village collectives to avoid more economic inequality and government corruption. Throughout this process, Tanzania had a lot of financial aid from foreign countries. As a result of Nyerere's actions, corruption, political instability, and ethnic strife decreased dramatically. Nyerere later retired from the presidency as he had done his job. Kenya welcomed foreign investment and profit incentives to jump-start it on its road to capitalism. The current unemployment was 45%, the annual growth rate was 3%, and 40% of the population lived below the poverty line. Conditions were made worse by the myriad of ethnic disputes throughout the country at the time. The current president, Daniel Moi, was accused of corruption and forced to retire. A new president, Mwai Kibaki, was elected. The opposition was very displeased with the outcome of the election, and protests became violent. A fragile truce was put in place to end the violence for good. Unlike the other countries in Africa, Angola and Ethiopia decided to experiment with Marxist-style communism. These two countries followed in the path of the Soviets, a Marxism-Leninism combination. The country received the help of Soviet experts and Cuban troops and advisors. However, there was severe internal opposition in both countries by the people. In Ethiopia, Muslims revolted, which led to the fall of the current leader. In Angola, UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, revolted. They controlled the rural population and threatened the capital city. The revolt finally ended when their leader died. The white population in South Africa maintained their hold of the apartheid for many years. President W. de Klerk released Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress leader, from prison. The two agreed that an election should be held to decide who runs the country. Nelson Mandela wins the election and becomes president. A new constitution was approved in 1996 that called for South Africa to become a multiracial state. Clark's party immediately opposed the new constitution, while most of the general population supported it. Nelson Mandela resigned from the presidency in 1999 and was replaced by his disciple Mbeki. Mbeki had the support of the whites as well as the elite blacks. However, he lacked the support of the labor groups. South Africa has now become the wealthiest and most industrialized state in all of Africa. Nigeria has the largest population in all of Africa and is one of the wealthiest due to its oil reserves. The country was controlled by military strongmen led by General Sani Abacha. This regime ruthlessly suppressed all the opposition it faced. Abacha later died, and Obasanjo becomes the leader of a new civilian government. Obasanjo has very high hopes and goals as a leader, but he fails to accomplish much of anything. Umaru Yar'Adua is elected in 2007. Religious disputes have become one of the largest problems in Nigeria. Specifically, the Muslim-Christian conflict is especially bad. The government creates new policies to limit and diminish some of the harsher aspects of Sharia law, which is the code of law for the religion of Islam.
Tensions in the desert. First started with the religious tensions happening in Nigeria. It eventually spread over the neighboring states. In the Ivory Coast, Christians in the south fought Muslims in the north. When the Niger government opposed Islamic law, Christian churches and bars were attacked and burned to the ground. Sudan, however, had farmers and herders fighting and competing for land. These confrontations often led to outbreaks of violence among religious and ethnic groups. Central Africa, cauldron of conflict. Civil war broke out between the majority and the minority, the Tutsis and Hutus. The Hutus wanted to put an end to the dominating Tutsis in Rwanda, leading to the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis, led by the members of the Hutu government. The African Union, a glimmer of hope. The United Nations passed the Millennium Declaration, hoping to reduce poverty and hunger worldwide by the year of 2015. But the goal has not been fully reached. But there is signs of progress toward political stability in some countries, including Senegal and South Africa. By 2001, the OAU was replaced with the African Union, which intended to provide greater political and economical stability. Education. The average African education takes place at home or in the village courtyard. Europeans introduced modern Western education in Africa. At first, the schools taught European languages and Western civilization. Eventually, it led to professional training. With independent African countries established their own state-run schools, primary level was the main focus, but high schools and universities were established in major cities. Unfortunately, funding and trained teachers are scarce in most states in Africa. Urban rural life. In cities where wealthy Africans live and work, they live like Westerners. They live in Western-style homes or apartments and eat Western foods. Some of them even drive Western cars like a Mercedes-Benz. Outside the cities, where 3/4 of the population live, Western influence has little impact. Many live like their ancestors did in thatch huts without modern plumbing and electricity. They farm or hunt by traditional methods. Tensions between traditional ways and Western culture still exist today, causing many issues still happening today in Africa.